The cantina on Kepler 7 station was always quiet during the third shift, with only a few scattered patrons nursing their drinks in the dim blue lighting that made everything look underwater. Kethver sat in his usual corner booth, his forearms wrapped around a steaming mug of bitter ale that reminded him of home. The old Zephyrian warrior had been coming here every night for the past 5 years, ever since he retired from active service and decided to spend his remaining days on this neutral station, where nobody asked too many questions about the past. His scarred reptilian face showed the marks of countless battles, with deep grooves running from his left eye down to his jaw where Terran plasma fire had nearly killed him during the siege of Proxima Station. The cybernetic implants that replaced his missing right arm whirred softly as he lifted the mug to his lips, a constant reminder of the war that had ended 20 years ago, but still haunted his dreams every night. A young Altarian journalist approached his table with hesitant steps, her blue skin pale with nervousness as she clutched a recording device in her thin fingers. She had been watching him for weeks, building up the courage to approach the famous veteran whose name was whispered in military academies across the galaxy. Kethver had commanded the elite 7th Shock Division during the Human Coalition War, and his tactical brilliance was legendary among those who studied galactic military history. "Veteran Kethver, my name is Zara, and I work for the Galactic Military Journal," she said in accented standard as she stood beside his table. "I have been researching the Human Coalition War for my dissertation, and I would be honored if you would share your experiences with our readers who want to understand what really happened during those terrible years." Kethver looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much death and destruction to ever fully heal. He had turned down dozens of interview requests over the years, preferring to keep his memories locked away where they could not hurt anyone else. But something about this young scholar reminded him of his own daughter back on Zephyr Prime, and he found himself gesturing for her to sit down across from him in the worn leather booth. "The war," he said slowly, his voice rough from years of shouting orders over the sounds of battle. "Most people think they know what happened because they read the official reports, or watched the propaganda videos that both sides produced after the peace treaties were signed. But the truth is much more complicated and far more terrifying than anything your professors taught you in their safe classrooms." Zara activated her recording device and leaned forward eagerly, her large eyes reflecting the blue light from the cantina's atmospheric processors. She had studied every available document about the conflict, but first-hand accounts from veteran combatants were extremely rare because most survivors preferred to forget rather than remember. When the Zephyrian Empire first made contact with humanity in 2385, our xenobiologists and military analysts spent months studying their technology, their social structures, and their defensive capabilities. Kethver continued, his mechanical fingers tapping against the metal table. The humans had only recently developed faster-than-light travel, and their ships were crude compared to our advanced fleet designs that had been perfected over thousands of years of interstellar warfare. He paused to take another drink, remembering the confidence that had filled the war rooms of the Imperial High Command as they planned what they believed would be a simple conquest operation. The humans controlled only 12 star systems at that time, with a total population of barely 8 billion spread across their colonies, while the Zephyrian Empire commanded over 300 systems and had been the dominant military power in this sector of the galaxy for millennia. Their weapons technology was at least 50 years behind ours. Their defensive networks were primitive, and their military doctrine appeared to follow standard patterns that we had encountered and defeated many times before when we absorbed other species into the Empire, Kethver said, his voice growing quieter as he recalled the fatal miscalculations that had led to disaster. "Our strategic planners estimated that total human resistance would collapse within 6 weeks of the initial assault, and that we would need only a minimal occupation force to maintain order while we integrated their systems into our supply chains." The veteran's expression darkened as he remembered the first intelligence reports about human society that had made the Imperial Council so confident about their chances of success. The humans appeared to be divided into competing nation-states that spent more time fighting each other than preparing for external threats. Their military forces were scattered across multiple command structures, and they seemed to lack the unity that would be necessary for effective resistance against a coordinated invasion. We studied their historical conflicts and found patterns that suggested they would surrender quickly once their major population centers were threatened. Kethver explained, his cybernetic arm clicking as he gestured to emphasize his points. Most species follow predictable behavior when faced with overwhelming force, and our psychologists assured the High Command that humans would negotiate for favorable surrender terms rather than sacrifice their civilians in hopeless battles. Zara nodded as she took notes, trying to imagine how different the galaxy might have been if the Zephyrian Empire had successfully conquered humanity before they could develop into the terrifying military force that now made every other species nervous. The current balance of power in the galaxy was largely maintained by the knowledge that nobody wanted to face human retaliation for aggressive actions. The initial invasion plan was elegant in its simplicity, Kethver said, his voice taking on the professional tone he had used when briefing his officers before combat operations. We would strike simultaneously at their three most important colonies in the Tau Ceti system, capturing their industrial infrastructure intact while demonstrating our overwhelming superiority to discourage resistance from their remaining systems. Once we controlled their primary manufacturing capabilities, the other human worlds would have no choice but to accept our terms. The old warrior's eyes grew distant as he remembered the excitement that had filled the troopships as they prepared for what everyone believed would be a routine conquest operation. The 7th Shock Division was the Empire's most elite unit, with a perfect victory record against 17 different species over the past century. Their soldiers were veterans of countless campaigns, equipped with the finest weapons and armor that Zephyrian technology could produce. I remember standing on the bridge of our flagship as we dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Tau Ceti system, Kethver said softly. The human colony ships looked so small and fragile compared to our massive dreadnoughts, and their defensive platforms seemed almost laughably inadequate to protect the millions of people living on those worlds below. I actually felt sorry for them because I knew they had no idea what was about to happen to their peaceful little civilization. Kethver stared into his drink for a long moment before continuing, his cybernetic fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that matched his slowly beating heart. Zara waited patiently, sensing that the old warrior was gathering himself for memories that still caused him pain even after all these years. The cantina around them had grown even quieter as the night shift workers settled into their routines, leaving the two of them alone with the ghosts of the past. The first assault on New Boston Colony was supposed to be a textbook operation, Kethver said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. My 7th Shock Division had executed similar landings dozens of times against other species, and we knew exactly what to expect from the tactical manuals that had been written over centuries of successful campaigns across the galaxy. He paused to take another sip of his ale, remembering the confidence that had filled the transport ships as they descended through the atmosphere of the human world. The orbital bombardment had been precise and surgical, targeting only military installations and communication centers while leaving the civilian infrastructure intact for future use by the Empire. Standard procedure called for a show of overwhelming force followed by negotiations with whatever government remained functional. We expected organized resistance from their planetary defense forces, perhaps some scattered militia units, and the usual civilian evacuation efforts that most species attempt when faced with invasion. Kethver continued, his reptilian features twisting into an expression that might have been confusion or fear. What we found instead was something that violated every principle of civilized warfare that had been established by the Galactic Council over thousands of years. The veteran's mechanical arm whirred as he gestured toward the cantina's viewport, where the stars visible beyond the station seemed cold and distant in the eternal darkness of space. He remembered how those same stars had looked from the surface of New Boston as his troops advanced through the seemingly abandoned streets of the colony's capital city, expecting to find cowering civilians and perhaps a few desperate soldiers. Making a final stand. Commander Danny Rodriguez had apparently spent months preparing for our arrival, but not in any way that our intelligence analysts had predicted, Kethver said, his voice growing harder as he recalled the first signs that this would not be a normal conquest. Instead of evacuating the non-combatants and concentrating his military forces for conventional defensive operations, he had done something that no species in recorded galactic history had ever attempted. Zara leaned forward in her seat, her recording device capturing every word as the old warrior described events that had been classified by both sides for decades after the war ended. The official histories mentioned the Battle of New Boston only briefly, noting that it had been the first major engagement of the conflict, but the details of what actually happened had never been released to the public. Every human civilian on that planet had become a combatant, Kethva said slowly, as if he still could not quite believe what he was saying. Children who looked barely old enough to walk were operating sophisticated explosive devices that had been hidden throughout the city. Elderly humans who should have been seeking shelter were conducting coordinated attacks against our supply lines with weapons that they had apparently built in their own homes. The veteran's eyes grew distant as he remembered the shock that had rippled through his command structure when the reports started coming in from his forward units. Zephyrian military doctrine had no provisions for dealing with an enemy where the distinction between soldier and civilian had been completely erased, where every building might contain hostile forces and every street corner could be a carefully prepared ambush site. Lieutenant Amy Foster's engineering unit demonstrated tactical innovations that turned ordinary household items into devastating weapon systems. Kethver continued, his mechanical fingers clenching into a fist. They had somehow converted civilian vehicles into mobile bomb platforms, transformed children's toys into remote-controlled reconnaissance drones, and turned cooking equipment into chemical weapon factories that produced toxins specifically designed to affect Zephyrian physiology. He paused again, remembering the growing sense of unease that had filled his command post as his officers reported one impossible situation after another. The humans were not just resisting. They were adapting their tactics in real time, learning from each engagement and developing new countermeasures faster than Zephyrian forces could respond to their innovations. What disturbed me most was not just their willingness to fight against overwhelming odds, but their apparent enjoyment of the combat itself, Kethver said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. I had fought against dozens of different species over my career, and I understood the desperation that drives beings to defend their homes and families. But the humans were different. They seemed to find genuine pleasure in the act of warfare itself. Zara shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to imagine what it must have been like for the veteran soldiers of the Empire to encounter an enemy that treated combat not as a grim necessity but as some kind of twisted entertainment. The psychological impact of facing opponents who enjoyed killing must have been devastating for troops who were used to fighting against reluctant defenders. The breaking point came when Major Chris Walker's forces deliberately destroyed their own infrastructure rather than allow us to capture it intact. Kethver continued, his cybernetic arm sparking slightly as his emotional state affected its delicate circuitry. They detonated their power plants, collapsed their transportation networks, and poisoned their water supplies. No other species had ever chosen to render their own worlds uninhabitable rather than submit to occupation. The old warrior's voice grew bitter as he remembered watching the human colony burn from orbit, the flames visible even from space as the defenders carried out their scorched earth tactics with methodical precision. The Zephyrian Empire had conquered hundreds of worlds over the millennia, but they had never encountered enemies who would rather see their civilization destroyed than preserved under new management. We realized during those first terrible days that we were not fighting a conventional military force, Kethver said, his eyes meeting Zara's across the table. We were fighting an entire species that had somehow weaponized their own extinction. Instinct. They would rather die fighting than live under our rule, and they had the technological knowledge and tactical creativity to make that choice extremely expensive for anyone who opposed them. The cantina's atmospheric processors hummed quietly in the background as both beings contemplated the implications of what had been revealed. The young journalist was beginning to understand why so few veterans of the Human Coalition War were willing to discuss their experiences, and why the mere mention of human military capabilities still made seasoned warriors across the galaxy nervous even decades after the peace treaties had been signed. Kethver's cybernetic arm twitched involuntarily as he recalled the next phase of the war, and Zara noticed how his remaining natural hands trembled slightly when he reached for his drink. The old veteran had been composed during his earlier recollections, but something about the memories he was approaching now seemed to affect him more deeply than the initial shock of human resistance tactics. 3 months after New Boston, the High Command decided that we needed to capture Armstrong Station intact, Kethver said, his voice becoming flat and emotionless in the way that soldiers sometimes spoke when describing events too terrible for normal expression. The asteroid mining facility was the primary source of rare minerals that powered human technology, and our strategists believed that controlling their resource supply would force them to negotiate for surrender terms. The mining station had been humanity's crown jewel in the outer system, a massive installation carved into a metallic asteroid that had taken decades to construct and represented the pinnacle of human engineering achievement. Intelligence reports indicated that it was defended by only a small garrison and could be taken with minimal casualties if the assault was conducted properly. Colonel Ben Parker was the human commander responsible for the station's defense, and our analysts had studied his previous military record extensively, Kethver continued, his reptilian features showing the same confusion that had plagued Zephyrian Command during the war. He had served in several conflicts between human nation-states and had always followed conventional defensive doctrine, establishing perimeter defenses and fighting delaying actions while waiting for reinforcement. The veteran paused to collect his thoughts, remembering the confidence that had filled the briefing rooms as his superiors planned what they believed would be their first significant victory against human forces. The 7th Shock Division had been reinforced with additional ships and troops, and the assault plan called for a coordinated attack that would overwhelm the station's defenses before the humans could implement their destructive tactics. Captain Nina Cross was Parker's chief engineer, and our intelligence suggested that she was responsible for maintaining the station's critical systems, Kethver said, his mechanical fingers drumming against the table in a nervous rhythm. We planned to capture both of them alive so that they could be forced to cooperate in keeping the mining operations functional under Imperial management. Zara made notes on her recording device, trying to imagine the pressure that must have been building on Zephyrian commanders as they struggled to achieve a meaningful victory against an enemy that seemed to defy every tactical principle that had worked against other species. The political implications of a prolonged war were becoming serious, and the Empire needed to demonstrate that human resistance could be overcome. The assault began exactly as planned, with our ships emerging from hyperspace in perfect formation and immediately establishing fire superiority over the station's defensive platforms, Kethver said, his voice taking on the professional tone that military officers used when describing complex operations. My troops executed their boarding procedures flawlessly, and within 6 hours we had secured what appeared to be control of all major systems. The old warrior's expression darkened as he remembered the moment when everything had started to go wrong, when the careful plans that had taken weeks to develop began falling apart in ways that nobody had anticipated. The humans had not fought for their station in any conventional sense, offering only token resistance before apparently abandoning their positions. We found the facility completely evacuated except for a few automated systems that seemed to be running routine maintenance programs, Kethver continued, his cybernetic arm sparking again as his emotional state interfered with its delicate electronics. Parker and Cross were nowhere to be found, and our technical specialists reported that all the mining equipment appeared to be functioning normally despite the lack of human personnel. The veteran took another drink, remembering the growing sense of unease that had filled his command post as his officers reported their findings from different sections of the massive station. Everything seemed too easy, too convenient, and experienced soldiers learned to be suspicious when operations proceeded more smoothly than expected. It took our engineers almost 12 hours to realize what the humans had actually done, Kethver said slowly, his voice barely audible above the quiet hum of the cantina's life support systems. They had not abandoned the station to avoid a fight. They had converted the entire asteroid into the largest kinetic weapon in recorded galactic history. Zara's eyes widened as she began to understand the implications of what the veteran was describing, and she could see why this particular memory still haunted him decades after the events had occurred. The humans had sacrificed their most valuable installation not to deny it to their enemies, but to turn it into a weapon against the entire Zephyrian fleet. Parker and Cross had spent months secretly modifying the station's propulsion systems and gravitational controls, Kethver continued, his mechanical fingers clenching into fists. When our ships moved into position around the asteroid, they triggered a sequence that sent the entire facility on a collision course with our flagship at a significant percentage of light speed. The old warrior's voice grew bitter as he remembered the panic that had filled the fleet communications channels when the true nature of the human trap became clear. The Zephyrian admiral had been forced to choose between sacrificing his most powerful ship or ordering the destruction of billions of credits worth of infrastructure that the Empire had hoped to capture intact. We had to use our main weapons to destroy the station completely, vaporizing not only the facility itself, but also 3 of our own ships that had been caught in the blast radius, Kethver said, his eyes reflecting the blue light from the cantina's atmospheric processors. The humans had achieved something that no enemy had ever accomplished in the history of the Zephyrian Empire. They had forced us into a purely defensive action. The psychological impact of the Armstrong Station incident had rippled through the entire invasion fleet as soldiers who had never known defeat struggled to understand an enemy that could turn their greatest assets into weapons against their opponents. The humans were not just fighting to win. They were fighting to demonstrate that conventional military thinking was useless against their tactical innovations. That was the moment when I began to understand that we were not fighting a war in any sense that our military academy textbooks had prepared us for, Kethver said quietly. We were fighting against a species that had weaponized the concept of acceptable losses and turned strategic sacrifice into an art form that made every victory feel like a defeat. The atmosphere in the cantina had grown heavy with the weight of Kethver's memories, and Zara found herself unconsciously leaning back in her seat as the old warrior's tale grew darker with each passing moment. His cybernetic arm had begun emitting small sparks more frequently, a sign that his emotional state was interfering with the delicate neural interfaces that controlled the mechanical limb. After Armstrong Station, everything changed in ways that our military leadership could never have anticipated, Kethver said, his voice becoming hollow as he stared at something only he could see in the dim lighting of the cantina. The humans had demonstrated that they were willing to sacrifice anything and everything to inflict damage on our forces, but that was only the beginning of our nightmare. The veteran paused to finish his drink, and Zara noticed that his remaining natural hands were shaking more noticeably now as he set the empty mug back on the table. She had interviewed dozens of war veterans from various species over the years, but none of them had displayed the level of psychological scarring that seemed to radiate from this old Zephyrian soldier. General Rick Stone and Admiral Helen Brooks began implementing what they called asymmetric escalation protocols. Kethver continued, his mechanical fingers tapping against the table in an irregular pattern that suggested barely controlled anxiety. For every tactical advantage that we developed through superior technology or numerical superiority, the humans would create 3 different countermeasures that turned our strengths into weaknesses. The concept of asymmetric warfare was not unknown to galactic military strategists, but the speed and creativity with which human forces adapted their tactics had no precedent in recorded history. Most species required months or years to develop effective responses to new enemy capabilities, while the humans seemed to evolve their strategies in real time during active combat operations. When we deployed our energy shield technology to protect our ground forces from human kinetic weapons, they immediately switched to chemical and biological agents that could penetrate our defenses. Kethver said, his voice growing quieter as he recalled the horror of watching his soldiers die from toxins that had been specifically engineered to affect Zephyrian physiology. When we developed countermeasures for their chemical attacks, they found ways to turn the environment itself into a weapon against us. The veteran's cybernetic arm sparked more violently as he remembered the Proxima campaign, where human forces under Colonel Steve Garcia and Major Beth Clark had demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that bordered on prescience. The humans had somehow calculated stellar weather patterns months in advance and positioned their forces to take advantage of natural phenomena that the Zephyrian fleet had not even considered relevant to military operations. They used solar flares as cover for coordinated strikes against our ships, Kethver said, his reptilian features twisting into an expression of reluctant admiration. Our sensors were blinded by the electromagnetic interference, and our communication systems were disrupted just long enough for human forces to launch surprise attacks that inflicted crippling damage before disappearing back into the cosmic background radiation. Zara made careful notes as the old warrior described tactical innovations that seemed to violate the basic principles of physics and probability. The humans had not simply adapted to their environment. They had learned to weaponize the universe itself against their enemies, turning stars and planets into allies in their fight for survival. The psychological warfare began in earnest during the 4th month of the conflict. Kethver continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Communications specialist Captain Drew Murphy had somehow infiltrated our secured database networks and was broadcasting detailed personal information about individual Zephyrian soldiers directly to their families back home. The veteran paused, remembering the shock that had rippled through the invasion fleet when soldiers began receiving messages from their own relatives, begging them to surrender before the humans could reach the Zephyrian homeworlds. The implications were terrifying beyond anything that military planners had considered possible. Murphy was not just gathering intelligence, Kethver said, his mechanical arm clicking as he gestured to emphasize his point. He was conducting a comprehensive psychological demolition campaign designed to destroy our will to fight by making every soldier believe that their families were in immediate danger from human retaliation. The old warrior's eyes grew distant as he recalled the growing paranoia that had infected every level of the Zephyrian command structure, as officers began to suspect that their own communication systems had been compromised and that the humans were listening to every conversation. The enemy had somehow turned information itself into a weapon more devastating than any conventional military technology. We started experiencing what our medical officers classified as human terror syndrome, Kethver said, his voice becoming clinical as he described the psychological condition that had begun affecting increasing numbers of Zephyrian troops. Soldiers would panic at the mere thought of engaging human forces, and some units refused direct orders to advance against enemy positions. The syndrome had spread through the invasion fleet like a plague, as stories of human tactical innovations and psychological manipulations were shared between units in hushed conversations that grew more terrifying with each retelling. The humans had somehow weaponized fear itself, turning the Zephyrian military's own communication networks against them. The propaganda campaign that Intelligence Officer Major Kate Johnson coordinated was devastatingly effective, Kethver continued, his cybernetic fingers clenching into fists. She had somehow gained access to our internal personnel files and was using personal information to create targeted psychological attacks that were customized for individual soldiers. Zara shifted uncomfortably in her seat as she began to understand the scope of human information warfare capabilities, and she could see why the mere mention of these tactics still caused visible distress in veterans decades after the conflict had ended. The humans had not simply fought a military campaign. They had conducted a systematic psychological assault on their enemy's capacity for organized resistance. By the 6th month of the war, we were not fighting human military forces, Kethver said slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible memories. We were fighting our own fear of what the humans might do next, and that fear was more effective than any weapon they could have deployed against us. The old warrior sat in silence for a long moment, his cybernetic arm sparking intermittently as he struggled with emotions that his artificial limb could not properly process. Zara waited patiently, sensing that he was approaching the most difficult part of his story. The silence stretched between them for several minutes as Kethver struggled to find words for memories that have haunted his dreams for 20 years. His cybernetic arm had stopped sparking, but the mechanical limb hung motionless at his side, as if the neural connections had been severed by the weight of what he was remembering. Zara waited patiently, understanding that she was about to hear something that few beings in the galaxy had ever been told. The war did not end with a great battle or a decisive victory, Kethver said finally, his voice so quiet that the young journalist had to lean forward to hear him over the gentle hum of the cantina's life support systems. It ended with the gradual realization that we could never win against an enemy that treated warfare as a creative problem to be solved rather than a necessary evil to be endured. The veteran's remaining natural hands trembled as he traced patterns on the metal table with his clawed fingers, drawing invisible maps of star systems that had become graveyards for Zephyrian ambitions. The Empire had committed nearly half of its total military resources to the human campaign, and every month of continued fighting brought reports of new tactical disasters and psychological casualties. Lieutenant Sam Taylor was the human operative, who finally demonstrated that victory against them was impossible. Kethver continued, his reptilian features showing a mixture of fear and reluctant respect. Somehow, this single individual managed to infiltrate our home fleet and gain access to the command systems of our most heavily guarded ships. The implications of Taylor's achievement had sent shockwaves through the highest levels of the Zephyrian government, as military leaders struggled to understand how their supposedly impenetrable security measures had been bypassed by an enemy agent. The humans had not simply demonstrated that they could defend their own territory. They had proven that nowhere in the galaxy was safe from their reach. Taylor did not sabotage our ships or steal classified information, Kethver said, his voice becoming hollow as he recalled the moment when everything had finally fallen apart. Instead, he transmitted a simple message to our fleet commanders, explaining in precise technical detail how our own vessels could be converted into weapons against the Empire using modifications that required only basic engineering knowledge. The psychological impact of this demonstration had been devastating beyond anything that conventional weapons could have achieved, as Zephyrian officers realized that their own technology could be turned against them by enemies who understood their systems better than they understood themselves. The humans had weaponized knowledge itself, making every piece of Imperial equipment a potential threat to its operators. The High Command called for immediate peace negotiations after Taylor's message was received. Kethver continued, his cybernetic arm twitching slightly as suppressed emotions interfered with its control systems. We could not continue fighting an enemy that had demonstrated the ability to turn our own military assets against us whenever they chose to do so. Zara made careful notes as the old warrior described the surreal atmosphere that had surrounded the peace talks, where Zephyrian negotiators found themselves in the unprecedented position of asking for mercy from a species they had originally planned to conquer. The humans had not demanded territory or reparations, but their mere presence at the negotiating table had been a constant reminder of their terrifying capabilities. Ambassador Frank Davis represented humanity during the negotiations, and his behavior was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire experience, Kethver said, his voice taking on the tone of someone describing a particularly vivid nightmare. He was polite, reasonable, and genuinely interested in establishing peaceful relations between our species, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was constantly calculating how to destroy everyone in the room if circumstances required it. The peace agreement that emerged from those negotiations had established the current balance of power in the galaxy, with humanity controlling a relatively small, number of star systems, but commanding the respect and fear of every major civilization. The humans had demonstrated that they could defend themselves against any aggressor, and their diplomatic proposals included mutual defense pacts and technology-sharing arrangements that benefited all parties. The most terrifying aspect of the human negotiating position was their apparent lack of interest in conquest or revenge. Kethver continued, his mechanical fingers drumming against the table in a nervous rhythm. They did not want to rule the galaxy or punish the Empire for the invasion. They simply wanted to be left alone to pursue their own development without interference from other species. The veteran paused to order another drink from the cantina's automated service system, and Zara noticed that his movements had become more deliberate and controlled as he approached the end of his story. The old warrior seemed to be gathering himself for one final revelation that would complete the picture of humanity that had emerged from his terrible memories. 20 years have passed since the peace treaties were signed, and I have spent that time trying to understand what makes humans so different from every other species in the galaxy, Kethver said, his voice becoming stronger as he reached his conclusion. I finally realized that the answer is not their technology or their tactics, but their fundamental psychology. The old warrior's eyes met Zara's across the table, and she could see the mixture of fear and fascination that still filled him when he thought about humanity's place in the galactic community. The humans had become the apex predators of civilized space, not through conquest or intimidation, but through the simple demonstration that they could not be conquered or intimidated by anyone else. They do not fight wars to achieve political objectives or economic advantages, Kethver said slowly, his cybernetic arm clicking as he emphasized each word. They fight wars to prove that warfare itself is futile against an enemy that refuses to accept defeat under any circumstances. That is what makes them the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The interview was drawing to a close, and Zara could feel the weight of everything she had learned settling into her consciousness like a heavy burden that she would carry for the rest of her life. She understood now why human space was considered inviolate by every major galactic power, and why the mere mention of human military capabilities could silence entire diplomatic conferences. My advice to any species considering conflict with humanity is simple, Kethver said as he stood to leave, his scarred features showing the exhaustion of someone who had relived too many painful memories in a single evening. Do not underestimate the species that turned warfare into an art form and made the galaxy safer by demonstrating that some civilizations are simply too dangerous to fight. The old warrior walked away into the dim corridors of Kepler 7 station, leaving Zara alone with her recording device and the knowledge that she had just documented one of the most important untold stories of the modern galaxy.